I never believed in monsters until I fell in love with one. My name is Seraphine, and this is the story of how I ran from the man who could have destroyed me, and how, 3 years later, a storm brought us back together in the most terrifying way possible. It was raining. Not the gentle kind of rain that taps softly on windows and makes you want to curl up with tea. No, this was the kind of rain that felt like the sky was trying to erase the world, to wash away every mistake, every memory, every trace of what shouldn't exist. The drops were cold and sharp, like tiny daggers falling from heaven, and I was running through them with my son clutched against my chest. Noah, my beautiful, impossible Noah, who was burning up with fever so high I could feel it through both our rain-soaked clothes. He was only 2 years old, with eyes that sometimes seemed to glow in the dark, eyes that reminded me of his father every single day. His small body was limp in my arms, and his breathing had become so shallow that I had to keep checking to make sure his little chest was still rising and falling. The hospital was just ahead, its lights cutting through the storm like a beacon of hope. I remember thinking that we were going to make it, that modern medicine would save him, that I had been so careful, so vigilant for 3 years, protecting him from the truth of what he was, half human, half something else, and that I could keep protecting him forever. I was wrong. The moment I burst through those hospital doors, soaked and desperate, the lights went out. Every single one. The building plunged into complete darkness, and I could hear the confused shouts of doctors and nurses, the beeping of machines going silent, the collective gasp of dozens of people realizing that something had gone terribly wrong. A blackout. A complete power failure in the only hospital within 50 miles. I stood there in the dark entrance, water pooling around my feet, holding my dying son, and I felt something break inside me. Not my heart that had broken 3 years ago when I left. This was different. This was my hope shattering into pieces so small, I knew I'd never be able to put them back together. And that's when I felt him. Before I saw him, before I heard him, I felt his presence like a change in air pressure, like the moment before lightning strikes. My skin prickled with recognition, with memory, with a fear I thought I'd buried. The rain seemed to slow around us, each drop suspended for just a heartbeat too long. Seraphine. His voice came from behind me, barely above a whisper, but I would have recognized it anywhere. I would have recognized it in a crowd of thousands, in my dreams, in my nightmares. It was the voice that had once told me I was his entire world. The voice that had confessed what he truly was on a night very much like this one. I didn't want to turn around. God, I didn't want to turn around, because I knew that seeing him would undo 3 years of running. 3 years of trying to forget. 3 years of convincing myself that I'd made the right choice by leaving. But Noah made a small, pained sound against my chest, and my mother's instinct overrode everything else. I turned. Cale. He stood in the rain just outside the hospital entrance, and he looked exactly as he had the night I left. Time didn't touch him the way it touched normal people. His hair was still that impossible shade of dark that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. His skin was still pale as moonlight, and his eyes, those eyes that had once looked at me with such tenderness, were now wide with an expression I'd never seen on his face before. Fear. Cale, the creature who had lived for over 3 centuries, who had survived wars and plagues and the rise and fall of empires, was afraid. His gaze dropped to the small bundle in my arms, to the child whose face was barely visible beneath the blanket I'd wrapped him in. I watched as understanding dawned across his features, watched as his expression shifted from shock to something that looked almost like pain. The rain continued to fall between us, creating a curtain of water that blurred his edges, making him look even more like the ghost I'd been trying to escape. Neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. The only sound was the storm and the distant chaos inside the darkened hospital, and Noah's labored, breathing against my heart. Time seemed to stop in that moment, stretched thin like a thread about to snap. I realized that Cale was counting. I could see his lips moving slightly. Could see the way his eyes were fixed on Noah's chest, tracking each tiny breath with an intensity that was almost painful to witness. He was counting our son's heartbeats. The son he never knew existed. I'd kept Noah's secret for a reason. I'd run for a reason. And standing there, watching the vampire who had once promised me forever now stare at the child we'd created, all those reasons came flooding back. But so did the memories. The good ones I'd tried so hard to forget. Let me tell you about Cale. Let me tell you about who he was before the night I discovered what he was. Because you need to understand, he wasn't a monster when I met him. Or maybe he was, but he was the kind of monster who made you forget that monsters existed. I met him 4 years ago, in the most ordinary way possible. I was working late at the library. I was a librarian then, living a simple life in a small town, content with my books and my quiet routines. He came in just before closing, looking for a specific book about ancient poetry. I remember thinking he had the most interesting face I'd ever seen, all sharp angles and deep shadows, with eyes that seemed to hold centuries of stories. We talked about poetry for an hour after I should have closed up. He knew languages I'd never heard of, could recite verses from memory in a dozen different tongues. When I asked him where he'd learned so much, he smiled, and it was the saddest smile I'd ever seen, and told me he'd had a lot of time to read. He became a regular visitor after that night, always appearing just before closing, always interested in old books, always making me laugh in ways I hadn't laughed in years. He was charming and mysterious and impossibly well-read, and I found myself looking forward to his visits with an intensity that should have warned me something was different about him. It took 3 months before he asked me to dinner. Another month before he kissed me in the rain outside my apartment. 2 weeks after that before he told me he loved me with a desperation that made my heart ache. And 6 months into our relationship before he finally told me the truth. I remember that night so clearly it still feels like a fresh wound. We were at his house, and I'd never seen a house like his before. It was an old manor on the edge of town, the kind of place that looked like it belonged in a Gothic novel, all stone and shadows and secret rooms. He'd been acting strange all evening, distant and troubled, and when I asked him what was wrong, he just looked at me with such profound sadness. He told me he needed to show me something. He took my hand and led me to his study, to a room lined with books that predated the printing press, with artifacts that belonged in museums. And then he showed me photographs. Dozens of them, hundreds, photographs spanning over 300 years, and in every single one of them he looked exactly the same. I didn't believe him at first. I accused him of playing an elaborate joke, of being obsessed with some ancestor who looked like him. But then he did something that changed everything. He picked up a letter opener from his desk, a silver one, and dragged it across his palm. I watched his skin burn. I watched smoke rise from the wound. I watched him bleed, and his blood was darker than human blood, almost black in the dim light of his study. He told me he was a vampire, 347 years old to be exact. He told me about the hunger, about the loneliness, about watching everyone he'd ever cared about grow old and die while he remained unchanged. He told me about the curse of immortality, about the weight of centuries, about the isolation that came with being something that shouldn't exist. And then he told me he loved me more than he'd loved anyone in over 300 years, and that he was terrified of what that meant. I should have run that night. Any sane person would have run, but I didn't. Because when I looked into his eyes, I saw the same fear and vulnerability I felt. I saw someone who was tired of being alone, who wanted connection so badly he was willing to risk everything, including exposing what he truly was, for the chance at something real. So I stayed. For 8 more months, I stayed. And they were the happiest, most intense months of my life. Kale opened up a world I never knew existed, shared secrets and stories that spanned centuries. He was gentle and passionate and protective in ways that made me feel treasured. We talked about everything: art, history, philosophy, the nature of existence itself, but there was always a shadow hanging over us, the shadow of time, the shadow of what he was and what I was, and the fundamental incompatibility between mortality and immortality. He couldn't go out in sunlight, not without excruciating pain. He needed blood to survive, though he swore he never took it from humans anymore, only from animals or from supplies he obtained through connections I didn't ask too much about. He didn't age, didn't change, didn't have a heartbeat, unless he'd fed recently. And I was human, fragile, temporary, growing older every day while he remained frozen in time. We never talked about the future. How could we? What future was there for a mortal woman and an immortal creature? I knew on some level that our relationship had an expiration date. I just didn't know exactly when that date would arrive. And then I got pregnant. I didn't know it was possible, neither did he. In 3 centuries, he'd never heard of a vampire fathering a child. The undead weren't supposed to create life. It defied every rule, every legend, every scrap of knowledge he'd accumulated over his long existence. When I saw those 2 lines on the test, I knew everything was about to change. I told him that night. I remember sitting on his antique sofa in that Gothic manner, my hands shaking as I held the pregnancy test, trying to find the words. When I finally managed to tell him, he went completely still. Not the normal kind of still, the supernatural kind, where he looked more like a statue than a living thing. He asked me if I was sure. I told him I'd taken 5 tests, seen a doctor, confirmed it every way possible. We were having a baby. Something that shouldn't exist was growing inside me. His reaction wasn't what I expected. He didn't seem happy or scared or confused. He seemed ... resolved. Like he'd been waiting for something to go wrong, for the universe to remind him why creatures like him weren't meant to have normal lives. He told me he wanted me to get rid of it. Just like that. Cold, clinical. He said it wasn't safe, that we didn't know what kind of creature we'd created, that it could kill me, that the vampire council and organization I didn't even know existed would see it as an abomination. He said we needed to end it before anyone found out, before it became a problem we couldn't solve. I remember staring at him, at this man I'd loved so completely, and seeing a stranger. Seeing the monster he'd warned me he was, because he wasn't talking about a pregnancy or a situation. He was talking about our child, about the life we'd created together. I asked him how he could be so cold about it, how he could talk about ending a life, our child, like it was just another problem to be solved. I told him that I was keeping the baby, with or without his support. That's when his expression changed. He looked at me with such intensity, such desperation, and he told me I didn't understand. He said the vampire world was dangerous, that there were rules I didn't know about, politics and power struggles that had been going on for centuries. He said that a hybrid child, half human, half vampire, would be seen as a threat by some, a curiosity by others, and that neither of those things ended well. He told me that if I kept the baby, I would be putting all 3 of us in danger. He said he couldn't protect us from his world, not really, that no matter how powerful he was, there were forces older and stronger than him, and they wouldn't tolerate something as unprecedented as a hybrid child. I told him I didn't care. I told him I would rather face danger with my child than safety without them. I told him that maybe he'd lived so long he'd forgotten what it meant to take risks for the people you loved. That hurt him. I could see it in his eyes, the way he flinched as if I'd struck him. He reached for me, tried to take my hands, tried to explain that he was trying to protect me, that everything he was saying came from a place of love and fear. But I pulled away, because in that moment I realized something terrible. As much as I loved him, as much as he loved me, there was a fundamental difference between us. He'd lived for centuries, watched countless people die, become numb to loss in ways I couldn't understand. To him, letting go of this pregnancy was a logical choice, a strategic decision to avoid future pain. To me, it was already my child, already loved, already a part of my future. I couldn't imagine giving up. We argued for hours that night. He begged me to reconsider. I refused. He told me I was being naive, that I didn't understand what I was risking. I told him he was being a coward, that immortality had taught him how to survive, but not how to truly live. That word, coward, seemed to break something in him. His expression went cold, distant. And he told me in a voice I barely recognized that if I insisted on keeping the child, I was on my own. He said he couldn't be part of this, couldn't watch me throw my life away, couldn't stand by while I made a choice that would destroy us all. I left his manor that night. I left with tears streaming down my face and my hand pressed against my still flat stomach, making a silent promise to the tiny life inside me that I would protect them no matter what it cost me. I should have known he wouldn't accept my decision so easily. Cale had spent 3 centuries learning how to be patient, how to be persuasive, how to get what he wanted. Over the next few weeks, he tried everything. He sent me letters explaining the dangers in more detail. He showed up at my apartment with research about vampire-human hybrids from other supernatural communities. All of it ending badly. He introduced me to someone from the Vampire Council, an ancient, terrifying woman who told me in no uncertain terms that my child would not be allowed to live. That meeting changed everything, because it made me realize that Cale was right about one thing. His world was dangerous. Not just dangerous for me, but for our child. As long as I stayed anywhere near him, anywhere the vampire community knew about me, my baby would never be safe. So I ran. I planned it carefully, telling no one. I withdrew all my savings, packed only what I could carry, and in the middle of the night, ironically, while Cale was probably out hunting for the animal blood he needed, I left. I left my apartment, my job, my life, and I disappeared. I spent the next 3 years moving from town to town, never staying anywhere long enough to leave a trail. I worked cash jobs, stayed in cheap motels, avoided making friends or connections, and I gave birth to Noah in a small clinic in a town whose name I've already forgotten, with no family present, no father to hold my hand, just me and a kind midwife who asked no questions. The moment they placed Noah in my arms, I knew I'd made the right choice. He was perfect, impossibly, miraculously perfect. He had my dark hair and my olive skin, but his eyes were Cale's. That's strange. Shifting color that seemed to change in different lights. Sometimes blue, sometimes silver, sometimes almost violet. The doctors said he was remarkably healthy for a newborn. They didn't know that his heartbeat was slightly slower than normal, that his body temperature ran a few degrees cooler, that even as an infant, he seemed unusually aware of his surroundings. They didn't know that sometimes, when he cried at night, his cries had an edge to them that made me think of hunting calls and predator warnings. But he was mine, my son, my Noah, and I loved him with a fierceness that terrified me. For 3 years, I kept us hidden. I taught myself to be paranoid, to trust no one, to always have an exit plan. I monitored Noah carefully for any signs that his vampire heritage was becoming dangerous. He grew more slowly than human children, but faster than a full vampire would. He needed food, but could go longer without it than normal toddlers. He was stronger than he should be, more coordinated, with reflexes that sometimes shocked me. But he was also sweet and curious and gentle. He loved books, of course he did, with a librarian mother and a father who'd spent centuries reading. He loved music and rain and animals. He laughed easily and hugged fiercely and called me Mama in a voice that made every sacrifice worthwhile. I almost convinced myself we'd escaped, that we could live this quiet, hidden life forever, that the vampire world had moved on and forgotten about the human woman who'd run away pregnant. I was wrong. The fever started 3 days before that storm. At first, I thought it was just a normal childhood illness. Kids got fevers all the time, right? But this was different. Noah's temperature climbed and climbed far beyond what should have been possible. Human medicine didn't touch it. Nothing I tried made any difference. By the 3rd day, he was barely conscious. His little body was burning up from the inside, and I knew, the way mothers know things, that whatever was happening to him wasn't a normal illness. This was something related to what he was, to the impossible combination of genetics that made up his existence. I'd avoided hospitals for 3 years, terrified that any medical examination would reveal something unusual about Noah. But watching him deteriorate, feeling him grow limp and unresponsive in my arms, I realized I had no choice. I had to take the risk. I had to try to save him. So I wrapped him in blankets, I stepped out into that biblical storm, and I ran toward the hospital. Toward help. Toward hope. Toward Kyle. I didn't know he was there. I swear I didn't. But looking back now, I wonder if some part of me did. Some deep, instinctive part that remembered how he'd once told me he would always be able to find me, that the connection between us was written into something deeper than blood or bone. Standing there in the rain, in the darkness of that blacked-out hospital, with my dying son between us, I finally understood what I'd been running from for 3 years. Not the danger. Not the vampire world or its politics or its threats. I'd been running from this moment. From having to face Kale again. From having to confront what I'd taken from him, the knowledge of his own son. 3 years of his child's life, the choice I'd made without him. From having to admit that maybe, just maybe, I'd been wrong. The silence stretched between us, broken only by the storm and Noah's labored breathing. Kale took a step forward, then stopped himself, his hand half raised, as if he wanted to reach for us, but didn't dare. His eyes never left Noah's face. When he finally spoke again, his voice was rough, broken in ways I'd never heard it before. He asked me if that was his son, if the child in my arms was his. I could have lied. Part of me wanted to. But what was the point? He could probably hear Noah's heartbeat, that unusual rhythm that fell somewhere between human and vampire. He could probably smell the truth in our blood, could sense the connection that tied the 3 of us together. So I told him yes. I told him Noah was his son, and that he was dying, and that I didn't know how to save him. Kale's expression crumpled. This ancient, powerful creature who'd survived over 3 centuries looked like he was breaking apart right in front of me. He asked me why I never told him, why I kept this from him. His voice rising with emotion I'd never heard from him before, and grief and desperation all tangled together. I told him the truth. I told him I ran because I was protecting our son from the vampire world, from the council, from the danger he'd warned me about. I told him I chose Noah's safety over everything else, including Kale's right to know he was a father. He started to respond, started to say something that looked like it would tear him apart to voice, but Noah made a sound, a tiny, pained whimper, and both of us froze. The argument, the accusations, the 3 years of separation, none of it mattered in that moment. Our son was dying. Kale moved then, finally closing the distance between us. He moved with that supernatural speed vampires had, but he stopped just before reaching us, his hands hovering in the air as if he was afraid to touch, afraid that Noah would vanish like smoke if he tried. He asked if he could see him, if he could look at his son. I hesitated. God, I hesitated. Every instinct I'd developed over 3 years of running screamed at me to say no, to pull away, to protect Noah from this creature who was so dangerous, so other. But then I looked at Cale's face, really looked at it, and I saw something I'd never expected to see. He was crying. Vampires could cry. I'd learned that during our relationship, but I'd only seen Cale cry once before. The night he'd told me about the worst thing he'd done in 3 centuries, a story that had haunted him for decades. Now, standing in the rain looking at the son he'd never known existed, tears were streaming down his face, mixing with the rainwater, and he looked more human than I'd ever seen him. I adjusted Noah in my arms, turning him slightly so Cale could see his face. My son was barely conscious, his skin flushed with fever, his breathing shallow and rapid. But even in his delirium, Noah's eyes flickered open for just a moment, those eyes that were so much like his father's, and I swear he looked right at Cale. Cale made a sound somewhere between a sob and a gasp. He reached out with a shaking hand and touched Noah's forehead so gently, like he was afraid our son might shatter. His hand was cold against Noah's burning skin, and I saw him flinch at the temperature. He told me Noah was too hot, that no child should be that hot, that we needed to get him inside immediately. But even as he said it, we both looked at the darkened hospital behind us, at the chaos visible through the windows as staff ran around with flashlights and battery-powered equipment. I explained that there was a blackout, that the hospital had lost all power, that I didn't know what to do. The words came out in a rush, all my fear and desperation spilling over. I told him that the doctors in the last town had said there was nothing wrong with Noah, that all his tests came back normal, but that the fever kept climbing anyway. I told him I'd tried everything I could think of, every remedy, every medication, and nothing worked. Cale listened with that supernatural stillness of his hand still resting on Noah's forehead, his eyes scanning our son's face with an intensity that was almost frightening. When I finished, he looked at me, and his expression was filled with determination I recognized from years ago. He told me he knew what was wrong. He said that what was happening to Noah wasn't an illness in the traditional sense. It was a transformation. My blood went cold. I asked him what he meant, though part of me already feared the answer. Cale explained that hybrid children, the incredibly rare cases he'd researched desperately over the past 3 years, the information he'd gathered obsessively after I left, sometimes went through changes as they grew. Their vampire heritage, dormant since birth, would begin to assert itself. Usually around age 2 or 3, their body would start trying to complete the transformation, to become more vampire than human. But the problem was that Noah was only half vampire. His body was trying to transform, but it didn't have enough vampire blood to complete the process. He was stuck between human and vampire, burning up as his own biology tore itself apart, trying to be something it couldn't fully become. I felt like the ground had disappeared beneath my feet. I asked Cale if Noah was dying, if my son was dying because of what he was, because of the impossible thing we'd created together. Cale's jaw tightened. He told me not yet, that there might be a way to save him, but when I asked what, when I begged him to tell me how to help our son, he looked away. He actually looked away. And I saw something in his expression that terrified me more than anything else in certainty. He told me that he could give Noah his blood, that vampire blood had healing properties, could cure illnesses, could even bring humans back from the brink of death, but that for a hybrid child in the middle of a transformation, the effects were unpredictable. It might stabilize Noah, might give his body the vampire blood it needed to complete the change. Or it might kill him, might be too much for his half-human system to handle. Basically, Kale was telling me he could try to save our son, but that trying might be what killed him. I stood there in the rain, holding my burning child, facing an impossible choice. Let Noah die slowly from this transformation, or risk killing him quickly with a cure that might not work. Hope that human medicine could somehow figure out what was wrong, or trust the vampire who'd wanted me to end this pregnancy in the first place. Every maternal instinct I had screamed at me to say no, to keep Noah away from vampire blood, to find another way. But the logical part of my brain, the part that had kept us alive and hidden for 3 years, knew there was no other way. Human medicine couldn't fix this. Human doctors didn't even know this could exist. I looked at Noah, at his tiny face contorted with fever pain, at his chest rising and falling in that shallow, labored rhythm that meant we were running out of time. I thought about all the times I'd held him, fed him, comforted him. I thought about his laugh, his curiosity, the way he said mama like it was the most important word in the world. I thought about all the futures he might have, all the possibilities that were slipping away with every shallow breath, and I made a decision I knew would haunt me forever, regardless of the outcome. I looked at Kale, and I told him to do it. I told him to try to save our son. The relief that crossed his face was so profound it almost broke me. He nodded, then asked me to follow him. He told me we couldn't do this here, not in the chaos of the hospital, not where people might see. We needed privacy, needed to be away from humans who would ask questions we couldn't answer. Part of me balked at that. Part of me wanted to scream that we should be getting Noah inside, should be working with doctors, should be doing this safely. But I followed Kale anyway, because what choice did I have? This was beyond human medicine now. This was vampire magic, supernatural biology, forces I still barely understood. Kale led us to a car parked in the shadows of the hospital parking lot, a sleek black vehicle that looked like it cost more than I'd earned in the past 3 years combined. He opened the back door and gestured for me to get in with Noah. I slid into the leather interior, still clutching my son, while Kale got into the driver's seat. He told me to hold Noah steady, that this needed to be done carefully. Then he turned around in his seat to face us, and I saw him roll up his sleeve. In the dim light from the hospital's backup generators, his skin looked impossibly pale, like marble or snow. He produced a small knife from somewhere, I didn't see where, didn't ask. He told me that he was going to give Noah his blood, just a few drops at first, to see how he reacted. He explained that I needed to watch for certain signs if Noah's breathing became more regular. If his temperature started to drop, if his color improved, that meant it was working. But if his breathing got worse, if he started convulsing, if anything seemed wrong, I needed to tell Kale immediately so he could try to reverse it. I asked him how he would reverse it, but he didn't answer. The silence was answer enough. He didn't know if he could. Kale pressed the knife to his palm and dragged it across. I watched blood well up, that dark, almost black blood that wasn't quite like human blood. It moved more slowly, looked more viscous, and even from several feet away. I could smell it copper and something else, something ancient and wild that made my hindbrain scream danger. He leaned over the seat, holding his bleeding palm over Noah's mouth. My son was barely conscious, his eyes closed, his body limp in my arms. Kale told me to tilt Noah's head back slightly, to open his mouth. I did, moving on autopilot, every nerve in my body screaming that this was wrong, that I shouldn't be letting vampire blood anywhere near my child. But I did it anyway, because love makes you do impossible things. Kale let 3 drops fall into Noah's mouth, just 3, dark and heavy. For a moment, nothing happened. Noah didn't swallow, didn't react, didn't move. The blood just sat on his tongue, and I thought maybe this wasn't going to work. Maybe we were too late. Then Noah's whole body jerked. I grabbed him tighter, terrified, but Kale told me to hold on, that this was normal, that Noah's body was recognizing the vampire blood and responding to it. I watched as my son's throat worked, swallowing reflexively. I watched as his eyes suddenly opened wide and unfocused, but definitely open. And then I watched as the impossible happened. The fever seemed to break almost immediately. I could feel it. Could feel the terrible heat radiating from Noah's body start to diminish. His breathing changed, becoming deeper, more regular. Color started returning to his cheeks. Not healthy color, but better than the frightening flush of fever. Kale was watching intently, his bleeding hand still held out, ready to give more if needed. He asked me how Noah's pulse felt, if his heart rate was changing. I pressed my fingers against Noah's neck and felt his heartbeat, that unusual rhythm that was uniquely his. It was slowing down, becoming more steady, stronger. My son was stabilizing. The vampire blood was working. I started crying. I couldn't help it. Relief and fear and gratitude all crashed over me at once, and I pulled Noah closer, pressing my face against his hair, breathing in his scent and trying to convince myself that this was real, that he was going to be okay. Kale told me quietly that we should wait, that we needed to make sure the effect lasted, that sometimes vampire blood gave a temporary boost before the real changes began. So we waited there in that car, in the rain-dark parking lot, while I held our son, and Kale watched us both with an expression I couldn't quite read. Noah fell into what looked like actual sleep rather than delirium. His breathing stayed steady. His temperature continued to drop to something approaching normal. Every few minutes I would check his pulse, check his temperature, terrified that any moment the fever would spike again. But it didn't. Slowly, carefully, I let myself believe that Kale had saved him. After about 20 minutes of this vigil, Kale finally spoke again. His voice was soft, almost hesitant, so unlike the confident man I'd known years ago. He told me that Noah should be stable now, that the vampire blood would continue working in his system, helping him complete the transformation more gradually, more safely. I asked him what that meant. What Noah would become. Was he going to be more vampire now? Was he going to need blood? Was he going to have all the limitations and powers that Kale had? Kale admitted he didn't know for certain. Hybrids were so rare that there wasn't much information about them. But he thought Noah would probably end up somewhere in between, stronger than humans, with some vampire abilities, but not fully either species. He might need some blood in his diet, but probably not exclusively. He might have enhanced senses and strength, but might still be able to walk in sunlight without the agony Kale experienced. Basically, our son was going to be something unique, something unprecedented, something the vampire world would be very interested in. That thought sent cold fear through me all over again. I told Kale that Noah couldn't be exposed to the vampire community, that we needed to keep him hidden, that this changed nothing about why I ran in the first place. Kale's expression darkened. He told me I couldn't keep running forever, that if Noah's hybrid nature was asserting itself, there would be other changes, other emergencies. He said that I couldn't handle this alone anymore, that Noah needed someone who understood the vampire side of his heritage, who could teach him, guide him, protect him from the dangers I didn't even know existed. He told me Noah needed his father. I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell him that we'd been fine for 3 years, that I'd kept Noah safe, that we didn't need him. But looking at my son sleeping peacefully in my arms for the first time in days, alive because Kale had saved him, I knew that would be a lie. I'd kept Noah alive, yes, but alive and safe weren't the same thing. And after tonight, after watching my son nearly die from something I couldn't even understand, let alone fix, I had to face the truth I'd been avoiding for 3 years. I couldn't do this alone anymore. Kale seemed to read the conflict on my face. He leaned back in his seat, putting some distance between us, and his voice was gentle when he spoke again. He told me he wasn't asking to take Noah from me, wasn't demanding rights or making threats. He said he knew he'd lost any claim to those things when he'd reacted so badly to my pregnancy, when he'd pushed me away instead of supporting me. He told me he'd spent 3 years regretting that night, that he'd searched for me, desperate to apologize, to tell me he'd been wrong, that fear had made him say things he didn't mean. He said he'd found records of Noah's birth about 6 months ago and had been trying to track us down ever since, not to take Noah, but to beg me to let him be part of his son's life. He told me that when he felt my presence in this town, felt the familiar pull of our connection, he'd known immediately that something was wrong. That the only reason I would stop running was if I had no other choice. So he'd come to the hospital hoping to find us, terrified of what he might find. His honesty broke something inside me. 3 years of anger and fear and justified resentment started to crack. And underneath all of that, I found something I thought I'd buried. The memory of loving this man, of trusting him, of believing we could face anything together. I told him I'd been wrong too, that I should have given him a chance to process the news, to adjust to the idea of being a father. I admitted that I'd run partly to protect Noah, but partly because I'd been too scared of the vampire world. Yes, but also scared of being judged, of being told I wasn't good enough, of watching Kale choose his kind over our family. Kale reached over the seat, then, slowly, giving me time to pull away if I wanted to. When I didn't, he touched my hand, just his fingers brushing against mine, and the contact sent electricity through me. It had been 3 years since anyone had touched me with affection. 3 years since I'd allowed myself to feel anything other than fear and determination. He told me we both made mistakes driven by fear, but that we had a chance now to do better. For Noah's sake. He said he wanted to help, wanted to be present, wanted to learn how to be a father to this miraculous child we'd created. He promised me he wouldn't try to take over, wouldn't expose us to vampire politics, wouldn't do anything without my agreement. He just wanted a chance. I looked down at Noah, still sleeping peacefully in my arms, and I thought about all the times I'd seen other children with their fathers, all the moments I'd felt guilty for denying my son that experience. I thought about how Noah sometimes asked about his daddy, and how I'd never known what to tell him. I thought about the future, about the challenges we'd face as Noah grew and his hybrid nature became more apparent. And I thought about how, despite everything, despite 3 years of running and hiding and convincing myself I hated Kale, seeing him again had felt like coming home. So I made another impossible decision. I told him yes. I told him he could be part of Noah's life, could help us navigate this strange existence. But I also told him that if he ever put Noah in danger, if he ever exposed us to the Vampire Council or did anything that made me doubt our safety, I would disappear again, and this time he would never find us. Kale agreed immediately. He told me he would protect us both with everything he had. That Noah and I were more important than vampire politics, more important than his position in their world, more important than anything. The rain had started to lighten by then, fading from a deluge to a steady drizzle. Kale suggested we go somewhere safe, somewhere warm where Noah could rest properly, and we could talk about what came next. He told me he had a house about an hour away, on the Gothic manor I remembered, but a smaller, more modern place he'd acquired recently. I hesitated, but Noah chose that moment to stir in my arms, making a small, comfortable sound that was so different from his earlier pained whimpers. He was okay. He was actually okay. And I was exhausted, emotionally and physically drained in ways I hadn't felt in years. So I agreed. The drive was quiet. Kale navigated the rain-slicked roads with supernatural precision, never once seeming uncertain about the way. I sat in the back with Noah, watching my son sleep and occasionally glancing up to catch Kale watching us in the rearview mirror. Every time our eyes met, something passed between us, not quite forgiveness, not yet trust, but acknowledgement. Recognition of shared love for the child who connected us. The house Kale had mentioned turned out to be a beautiful modern cabin nestled in the woods. All clean lines and large windows. It looked nothing like his old manor, and somehow that made it easier to step inside. This wasn't the place where we'd fallen in love, where he'd revealed what he was, where we'd argued about the pregnancy. This was neutral ground. Inside was warm and comfortable. Decorated with surprising taste for someone who'd lived through so many different aesthetic periods. Kale led me to a guest room with a large, comfortable bed and told me to settle Noah there while he prepared some food for us, for me and Noah, he meant. He didn't need to eat, though he could if he wanted to maintain appearances. I laid Noah down on the bed, surrounding him with pillows to make sure he wouldn't roll off, and just watched him sleep for a long moment. His color was so much better now, his breathing deep and regular. Every few seconds I would touch his forehead, checking his temperature, making sure the fever stayed away. Kale appeared in the doorway carrying a tray with soup, bread, and tea. He'd remembered exactly how I liked my tea with honey and lemon, and that small gesture of memory made my throat tight. He set the tray on the bedside table and started to leave, to give me privacy. But I stopped him. I asked him to stay. He turned back, surprise evident on his face. I told him we needed to talk, needed to figure out what this arrangement would look like going forward. But more than that, I needed to hear his story. I needed to know what the past 3 years had been like for him, why he'd changed his mind about Noah, what had made him search for us. Kyle settled into a chair by the window, keeping his distance, but clearly grateful to be included. The storm continued outside, rain streaking down the windows, and in the warm, quiet room with our son sleeping between us, he told me everything. He explained that the night I left had broken something in him. He'd spent 3 centuries building walls around his heart, learning not to get attached, accepting his isolation as the price of immortality. But I'd gotten through those walls, made him hope for something different. When I got pregnant and he'd reacted so badly telling me to end it, he'd been speaking from 300 years of fear and self-preservation. But the moment I left, the moment he realized I was actually gone, all of that fear had shifted. Suddenly, he wasn't afraid of the vampire council or the dangers of a hybrid child. He was afraid of a future without me, without us, without the family we could have been. He told me he'd looked for me immediately. He'd used every resource available to vampires, every connection, every supernatural means of tracking. But I'd been smart, careful, had left no trail. For 6 months, he'd found nothing, and he'd started to believe I'd succeeded in disappearing forever. Then he'd done something he'd never done before. He'd gone to the Vampire Council and told them the truth. He'd admitted that he'd fathered a child with a human, that the woman carrying his hybrid offspring had fled, and that he needed their help finding us. My blood ran cold when he said that. I asked him how he could have exposed us like that, how he could have told the very people who'd threatened Noah's life. But Cal explained that he'd made a deal with them. He'd offered them information about other supernatural communities, political advantages he'd spent centuries accumulating in exchange for their agreement to leave Noah alone, to recognize him as Cal's heir, protected by his status, untouchable by vampire law. It had cost him nearly everything: his position, his influence, his carefully maintained neutrality in vampire politics. But he'd done it anyway because he'd needed the council's resources to find us, and he'd needed their guarantee that Noah would be safe once he did. It had taken another year before the council's network had picked up a birth record that matched what they were looking for. A boy born to a single mother who had no medical history, no paper trail, no existence before 9 months prior. The timing was right, the circumstances suspicious enough to investigate. By the time Cale had arrived in that town, we were already gone, but he'd kept searching, following the faint traces we left behind, always arriving just days or weeks too late. He'd been tracking us for almost 2 years, slowly closing the distance, learning to predict my patterns, understanding the way I thought, the way I ran. He told me he'd been in this town for 3 days before he felt my presence. He'd been preparing to approach me carefully, to try to talk to me without scaring me away. But then he'd felt something else, a disturbance, a supernatural distress signal that he'd immediately recognized as connected to Noah, a hybrid child in crisis called out to. Supernatural senses in ways humans couldn't detect. He'd run toward that signal and found the hospital, found the storm, found me standing there with our dying son in my arms. Listening to his story, understanding everything he'd sacrificed to find us and protect us, made my carefully maintained anger crumble even more. This wasn't the cold, frightened creature who'd told me to end my pregnancy. This was a father who'd crossed every line, burned every bridge to keep his son safe. I asked him about the council's agreement. I wanted to know exactly what protections Noah had, what limitations we were still under. Cale explained that as his acknowledged heir, Noah was protected by vampire law. No vampire could harm him without answering to Cale. The council had agreed to recognize Noah's unique status and allow him to exist in peace. But there were conditions. Noah couldn't be allowed to run wild, couldn't use any vampire abilities publicly, couldn't expose supernatural existence to humans. Basically, he needed to be raised with awareness of both worlds, human and vampire, and taught to navigate them carefully. That meant Cale needed to be involved in Noah's life, not just as a father, but as a teacher, a guide into the vampire world that was half of Noah's heritage. I understood the necessity of it, even as part of me still resisted. I told Cale that I appreciated everything he'd done, all the sacrifices he'd made, but that my primary concern had to be Noah's well-being. Not just his physical safety, but his emotional health, his happiness, his chance at a normal childhood. Cale agreed completely. He told me he didn't want to disrupt Noah's life, didn't want to be a source of stress or confusion. He suggested that we take things slowly, let Noah get to know him gradually, build a relationship naturally rather than forcing anything. He said he would follow my lead, respect my boundaries, prove that he could be trusted. For the first time in 3 years, I felt something like hope. Not that everything would be perfect or easy, but that maybe, just maybe, we could figure this out. That Noah could have both his parents, could grow up knowing both sides of his heritage, could be loved and protected by people who would do anything for him. We talked through the night while Noah slept. We discussed practicalities, where we would live, how we would handle Noah's education, what to do about documentation, and the paper trail that normal children left behind. Cale had resources I'd never dreamed of. Connections that could create ironclad false identities, safe houses around the world, protection I could never have provided alone. But more than the practical discussions, we talked about Noah himself. I told Cale's stories about the past 3 years, Noah's first words, his first steps, his personality quirks and preferences. I told him about the time Noah had scared me by climbing impossibly high on a playground structure, using that supernatural strength. I told him about Noah's nightmares, which sometimes felt too vivid, too real, as if he was somehow dreaming other people's memories. Cale listened to every word with an intensity that was almost painful to witness. He was hungry for these details, desperate to know everything about the son he'd missed. And I realized, watching his face, that I'd taken something precious from him. Yes, I'd had reasons. Yes, I'd been protecting Noah. But I'd also denied Cale the chance to know his child, and that had been a cruelty of its own. I apologized for that. Not for running, not for protecting Noah, but for the pain my choices had caused Cale. I told him I wished things had been different, that we'd been able to face the pregnancy together, that fear hadn't driven us apart. Cale told me there was nothing to apologize for, that I'd done what any mother would do, protected my child at all costs. He said the fault was his for responding so badly in the first place, for letting fear overrule love, for not being the partner I'd needed him to be. It was a strange conversation, both of us taking responsibility, both of us acknowledging our mistakes. There was no absolution, no magical moment where everything became okay. But there was understanding. There was a shared commitment to doing better. As dawn approached, I felt exhaustion finally catching up with me. The adrenaline that had kept me going through Noah's illness and the emotional confrontation with Cale was wearing off, leaving me hollowed out and bone-tired. Cale noticed immediately. He told me I should rest, that he would watch over Noah, that I was safe here. The offer was tempting, but I hesitated. 3 years of paranoia doesn't disappear in one night, no matter how many breakthroughs you have. Cale seemed to understand my hesitation. He told me he would stay in the room if I wanted, would sit by the window where I could see him, would do nothing but watch over us both. He said I needed sleep, that I'd been running on fear and determination for too long, and that Noah would need me strong when he woke up. So the first gave in. I lay down on the bed next to Noah, keeping him close, and let my eyes close. But even as sleep pulled at me, I remained aware of Cal's presence by the window, of his supernatural stillness, of the fact that for the first time in 3 years, someone else was sharing the burden of keeping Noah safe. I expected to have nightmares. I expected to sleep restlessly, to wake up panicking, but instead, I fell into the deepest, most peaceful sleep I'd had since the night I ran away. When I woke up, sunlight was streaming through the windows. Actual sunlight. I sat up in a panic, looking for Cale, terrified that the dawn had forced him to flee or worse. But he was still there, still in his chair by the window, bathed in the morning light, and he wasn't burning. I must have made some sound of shock because Cale turned to look at me and he had the strangest expression on his face, wonder and confusion mixed together. He told me he didn't understand it, that sunlight should have been agony, that he should have had to retreat to darkness hours ago, but it didn't hurt. The sunlight touched his skin and there was no smoke, no pain, no burning. It was as if the laws that governed his existence had suddenly changed. We stared at each other across the room, both of us trying to understand what this meant. Noah chose that moment to wake up, making a small sleepy sound and stretching in that way toddlers do. I immediately turned my attention to him, checking his temperature, looking for any signs of the fever returning. But Noah looked better than he had in days. His eyes were bright and alert, his color healthy, his energy returning. He looked up at me and smiled, saying, "Mama," in a voice that made my heart clench with relief and love. Then he noticed Cale. I watched my son's eyes fix on this stranger sitting by the window. Watched him study Cale with that intense curiosity children have. And then Noah said something that made my breath catch. He asked if that was Daddy. I don't know how he knew. We'd barely talked about his father, and I'd never shown him pictures. But somehow, Noah recognized Cale. Maybe it was some instinctive connection, some supernatural awareness of their shared blood. Maybe it was something simpler. Maybe he saw his own eyes looking back at him from Cale's face. Cale went completely still. That vampire stillness that made him look like a statue. His eyes were fixed on Noah with an expression of such profound emotion I couldn't even begin to name all the components of it. I told Noah, yes, that was his daddy, and that he'd come to help take care of him. I kept my explanations simple, age-appropriate, not mentioning vampires or danger or any of the complicated truth. Just that Daddy had been away, but was here now, and loved him very much. Noah considered this for a moment with that serious expression toddlers sometimes get when processing big information. Then he looked back at Cale and held out his arms. that universal gesture children make when they want to be held. I saw Kale's composure crack completely. He looked at me, silently asking permission, hardly daring to hope. I nodded, and he moved from the window to the bed with supernatural speed that he immediately tried to slow down. Not wanting to frighten Noah, he picked up our son with such careful gentleness, like Noah was made of glass, like he was the most precious thing in the world. And Noah, completely unafraid, wrapped his small arms around Kale's neck and hugged him. I watched the vampire who'd lived for over 3 centuries hold his son for the first time. Watched him close his eyes and breathe in Noah's scent. Watched a single tear slip down his face. This creature who'd seen empires rise and fall, who'd survived wars and plague and endless loss, was completely undone by a toddler's hug. Noah pulled back after a moment and patted Kale's face with one small hand, studying him intently. Then he announced that Daddy's hands were cold and asked if he was sick too. Kale laughed, tactually laughed, and told Noah no, that he wasn't sick, just that he was naturally cold. Noah accepted this with the easy logic of a 2-year-old and informed Kale that he would share his blanket to help him warm up. It was such a simple, innocent moment, but it broke something open in all 3 of us. This was real now. We were a family, strange and complicated and unprecedented, but a family nonetheless. Over the next few days, we settled into a careful routine. Kale had clearly prepared for our arrival, had stocked the house with food for Noah and me, had set up a room that could serve as a nursery, had thought of dozens of small details that made it clear how seriously he was taking this. He was patient with Noah, letting my son set the pace of their relationship. Sometimes Noah wanted Kale's attention, wanted him to play or read stories. Other times, Noah clung to me, needing the security of the parent he'd always known. Kale never pushed, never showed disappointment, just accepted whatever Noah was willing to give. I watched them together constantly, unable to fully let my guard down. But what I saw gradually eased my fears. Kale was gentle and attentive. He learned Noah's preferences quickly, what foods he liked, what games made him laugh, what signals meant he was getting tired or overwhelmed. He was patient in ways I wouldn't have expected from someone who'd never been a father before. And Noah blossomed under the attention of both parents. He seemed healthier, more energetic, more confident. Whatever the vampire blood had done, it had stabilized something in him. His temperature stayed normal, his strength seemed more controlled, his overall health better than it had been in months. But the strangest thing was the sunlight. Every morning, the sun would rise and Kale would still be there. No pain, no burning, no need to retreat into darkness. We couldn't explain it. Vampire law said that sunlight was deadly to his kind, that exposure would cause agony and eventually destruction. Yet Kale stood in the morning light day after day, and nothing happened. He researched obsessively, reaching out to ancient contacts in the vampire community, trying to find an explanation. The theories he got back were all speculative. Maybe the hybrid connection had somehow changed him. Maybe Noah's presence affected the supernatural laws that governed vampires. Maybe saving his son had triggered some unknown transformation. No one knew for certain. All we knew was that something fundamental had shifted. I had my own theory, though I kept it to myself at first. I thought maybe it had something to do with love. Kale had told me once that vampires existed in a state of stasis, frozen in the moment of their death, unable to truly change or grow. But saving Noah, choosing us over his fear, risking everything for his son, maybe that had broken the stasis. Maybe choosing life over death, choosing love over isolation, had changed something essential about what he was. It sounded ridiculous even thinking it, like something from a fairy tale rather than reality. But then again, our entire situation was impossible. A vampire and a human creating a hybrid child who shouldn't exist. That child's illness triggering changes in his father that defied every known rule. Maybe we were living in a fairy tale. Or maybe we were creating something new, something that had never existed before. About a week after Noah's recovery, Kale suggested that we talk about the future. Where we would live, how we would raise Noah, what kind of life we wanted to build. It was a conversation I'd been avoiding because it required me to make decisions I wasn't sure I was ready for. We sat outside on the cabin's deck, me and Kale, while Noah napped inside, monitored by the baby camera Kale had somehow acquired. The forest around us was peaceful, the only sounds birdsong and wind through the trees. It felt safe, isolated, like we were the only people in the world. Kale started by saying he understood if I wanted to maintain separate lives, that he wouldn't push for more than I was comfortable giving. He said he had resources to set me and Noah up anywhere we wanted, with any identity we chose, complete with documentation and security. He could visit regularly, could be part of Noah's life without us having to live together. But then he paused and his voice changed, became more vulnerable. He told me that what he really wanted, what he hoped for, was for us to be a real family. Not just co-parents managing a situation, but partners raising their son together. He said he knew he had no right to ask for that he'd lost that chance 3 years ago, but that he was asking anyway. He told me he still loved me, that he'd never stopped loving me. That 3 years of searching had only made him more certain that I was the only person in over 3 centuries who'd ever made him want to be more than what he was. I sat there listening, feeling emotions I'd locked away trying to surface. Because the truth was, I'd never stopped loving him either. I'd been angry and hurt and betrayed, yes, but underneath all of that, the love had remained, buried, but not dead. But love wasn't enough 3 years ago, and I wasn't sure it was enough now. I told Kale that I needed time, that what we'd built over the past week was fragile, based on crises and necessity rather than genuine reconciliation. I told him that before I could consider rebuilding our relationship, I needed to see how we functioned as co-parents, needed to trust that he wouldn't let fear drive his decisions again, needed to believe that we could actually make this work. Kale accepted this without argument. He told me we could take as much time as I needed, that he wasn't going anywhere, that proving himself to me and Noah was worth any amount of patience. So we continued our careful dance, living in the same house but maintaining appropriate distance. Co-parenting Noah but not acting like a couple. Building something new from the broken pieces of what we'd once had. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, things began to change. It started with small moments. Kale making me coffee exactly the way I liked it without being asked. Me laughing at one of his stories about historical figures he'd known personally. Noah falling asleep between us on the couch during a movie, both of us unconsciously moving closer to be near our son. We talked more openly than we had even when we were together before, about his long life, about the loneliness of immortality, about the weight of watching everyone you care about die, about my fears, about the responsibility of raising a hybrid child, about the paranoia that had defined my last 3 years. We talked about Noah, about his future, his needs, the challenges he would face. Kale taught me about vampire culture, about the supernatural world I'd only glimpsed before. I taught him about human development, about toddler psychology, about the normal childhood milestones he'd never experienced. We became partners in the truest sense, 2 people working together toward a common goal, learning to trust each other again one day at a time. And somewhere, in the midst of all that partnership and parenting and careful rebuilding, I realized I'd forgiven him. Not in one dramatic moment, but gradually, like ice melting in spring. I understood now that his initial reaction to my pregnancy had come from fear, not malice. That asking me to end it had been his panic speaking, not his heart. That he'd spent 3 years proving how wrong he'd been, how much he truly wanted our son. And I realized he'd forgiven me too. For running, for taking Noah, for denying him 3 years of his son's life. He understood that I'd been protecting our child, that I'd made impossible choices in an impossible situation, that love had motivated my actions just as fear had motivated his. Forgiveness, I learned, wasn't a single moment of absolution. It was a daily choice to let go of past hurts, to focus on the present, to build something better from the ruins of what had been broken. One evening, about 3 weeks after Noah's recovery, I found Cale in Noah's room watching our son sleep. This had become something of a ritual for him, standing vigil over Noah each night, as if he was making up for all the nights he'd missed, all the times he hadn't been there to protect his child. I joined him at the doorway, and we stood there together in comfortable silence. Noah was sprawled across his bed in that chaotic way toddlers sleep, completely relaxed and peaceful. He looked so healthy now, so vibrant and full of life, nothing like the feverish, dying child I'd carried through the storm. Cale turned to me and told me quietly that he'd never thought he could have this, that vampires weren't meant for families or normal lives or simple joys like watching their child sleep. He said that for 3 centuries he'd believed his existence was defined by what he couldn't have, what he'd lost, what was impossible for creatures like him. But Noah had changed everything. Our son was living proof that even impossible things could exist, that the rules weren't as fixed as everyone believed, that love could create miracles that defied logic and law. I told him that Noah wasn't the only miracle. I gestured to the window, to the faint light of dawn just beginning to show on the horizon. I reminded him that he could stand in sunlight now, that whatever had happened when he saved Noah had changed something fundamental about him. Cale followed my gaze to the approaching dawn, and his expression shifted to something like wonder. He admitted that he was still afraid every morning, still expected the sunlight to burn him, still couldn't quite believe that 300 years of limitation had somehow been lifted. I asked him what he thought had caused it, what had changed to allow something that should have been impossible. Cale was quiet for a long moment, thinking. Then he told me he believed that vampires existed in a state of death, not truly alive, suspended between existence and non-existence, bound by the rules of their curse. But when he'd given Noah his blood, when he'd risked everything to save our son, maybe he'd chosen life over death in a way that fundamentally changed what he was. Or maybe, he said, looking at me with an intensity that made my breath catch, it was simpler than that. Maybe love, real, genuine, selfless love, was the one thing powerful enough to break a centuries-old curse. I didn't have an answer for him. I didn't know if love could literally change supernatural law, didn't know if that was too romantic a notion to be true. But I knew that something had changed, not just in Kale, but in all of us. We stood there as dawn broke, watching the sunlight gradually fill Noah's room. Cale didn't flinch, didn't retreat, didn't show any sign of pain. The light touched his face, turned his pale skin almost luminous, and he looked more alive than I'd ever seen him. He looked human. Not fully human, of course. He was still faster and stronger and older than any human could be. But in that moment, bathed in morning light with his son sleeping peacefully nearby and me standing beside him, he looked like he could have a real life. A day life. A normal life. He looked like a father. That was the morning I decided to stop keeping him at arm's length. That was the morning I acknowledged that what we were building was worth the risk, worth the vulnerability, worth letting go of the fear that had defined the past 3 years. When Cale finally turned away from watching Noah, when his eyes met mine, I didn't look away. I held his gaze and I told him I'd been thinking about his question, about what he wanted for us to be a real family. I told him I wanted that too. The expression that crossed his face was indescribable. Joy and relief and disbelief all mixed together. He asked me if I was sure, if I'd really thought about it, warned me that it wouldn't be easy, that there would still be challenges and dangers and complications. I told him I knew all that. I told him that nothing about our situation had ever been easy, that our entire relationship had been complicated from the start. The danger was just part of the reality we lived in. But I also told him that watching him with Noah, seeing him choose us over his fear every single day, had shown me that we could face those challenges together. That together was better than apart, even if it was harder. Cale reached for me then, slowly, giving me time to pull away. When I leaned into his touch instead, he pulled me close and held me the way he used to. Like I was precious, like I was home. And standing there in the dawn light with our son sleeping nearby, I finally let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, we were going to be okay. The next few months were an adjustment. We had to figure out how to be a couple again while also being parents, how to balance Noah's needs with our own relationship, how to build a family structure that worked for our unique situation. It wasn't always smooth. There were arguments about boundaries, about safety protocols, about how much to tell Noah about his heritage. There were moments of frustration when Cale's 3 centuries of experience made him overconfident, or when my 3 years of single parenting made me too protective. There were nights when old fears resurfaced, when I would panic and want to run, when he would withdraw and become distant. But we worked through it. We learned to communicate better, to trust each other more, to lean on each other when things got difficult rather than pulling apart. And Noah thrived. He grew stronger and healthier, his hybrid nature stabilizing into something manageable. He developed abilities that were remarkable. He was stronger than human children his age, had reflexes that were almost supernatural, could see and hear things others couldn't. But he was also a normal, happy child who loved books and music and playing in the forest around our cabin. Cale taught him carefully, helping him understand and control his abilities without frightening him. I provided the human balance, making sure Noah understood that being different didn't mean being wrong, that his vampire heritage was just part of who he was, not all of who he was. Together, we gave him something neither of us could have provided alone: complete understanding of both sides of his nature, acceptance of all that he was. We kept our existence quiet, avoiding the supernatural community as much as possible. Cale's deal with the Vampire Council held, but we didn't push our luck by being too visible. We lived simply, peacefully, focusing on our family rather than the larger political implications of Noah's existence. And slowly, our little family of impossible things became normal. Not in the traditional sense. Nothing about us was traditional. But normal in the way that mattered. We loved each other, supported each other, built a life together despite all the reasons we shouldn't have been able to. I still think sometimes about that night in the storm, about standing in the rain with my dying son, seeing Cale for the first time in 3 years, making the impossible choice to trust him again. About how that single moment of crisis became the catalyst for everything that followed: the healing, the forgiveness, the rebuilding of what we'd lost. People talk about happy endings like they're fixed points, like you reach them and everything is perfect forever. But I've learned that's not how it works. Happy isn't an ending. It's a choice you make every day. A choice to forgive, to trust, to love, despite the risks. Every morning I watch Cale stand in the sunlight that should kill him, and I'm reminded that miracles are real. Not the flashy, dramatic kind from stories, but the quiet kind. The kind where curses are broken by love, where impossible things become possible, where broken people and broken creatures find ways to heal each other. Every day I watch Noah grow and learn and become more himself, part human, part vampire, fully loved. I see him laugh with his father, see them play together in the garden that surrounds our cabin, see Cale teaching our son about history and art and the weight of being different. I see the life we've built against all odds, against all logic, and every night, when Cale and I put Noah to bed together, when we stand in the doorway of his room watching him sleep, I'm grateful. Grateful that I ran when I needed to, grateful that I came back when it mattered, grateful that love proved stronger than fear. Because the truth is, monsters aren't really the creatures who live in darkness. Monsters are the fears that keep us from living fully, from loving completely, from taking the risks that might break us, but might also make us whole. Kale isn't a monster. He's a father, a partner, someone who loved so deeply he broke his own curse. Noah isn't an abomination. He's a miracle, proof that life finds ways to flourish even in impossible circumstances. And I'm not just a frightened woman on the run anymore. I'm a mother. I'm a partner. I'm someone who learned that sometimes the courage to look at the darkness again, to face the fears I ran from, is what saves us. The gardens around our cabin are blooming now. Kale planted them for Noah, flowers that bloom at night and day, representing both sides of our son's heritage. They shouldn't be able to grow together, night-blooming flowers and day-blooming flowers, sharing the same soil, thriving in the same space. But they do, just like we do. Every impossible thing, growing together, creating something beautiful from what shouldn't exist. That's the real miracle. Not the supernatural abilities or the broken curses or the hybrid child who lives between worlds. The real miracle is that love, messy, complicated, imperfect love, found a way. And every morning when the sun rises, when I watch light fill our home without causing pain, when I see my family whole and safe and happy, I remember that night in the storm. I remember being broken and desperate and terrified, and I'm grateful we found our way back to each other. Because sometimes what saves us isn't running from the darkness. It's having the courage to turn around, to face what frightens us, and to choose love anyway. Especially when that love seems impossible. The end.